Hi, welcome back to Not So Obvious Watches. I'm Pete McConville. Today I'm going to do a review of one of my bargain entry basement battler watches, the Seiko Neosport. Quickly, the brand, it's a Seiko. I'm not going to tell you about the Seiko, the company. If you don't know them, what the hell are you doing watching a watch channel? The model we're talking about today is the Neosport. I always forget reference numbers, so I'll just put it up above my head. In terms of year, it was kind of 2010 through to probably last year. I think it was discontinued in 2017, 2018. You will still see them in shops occasionally, which is how I got mine. In terms of functions, nothing particularly special, time and date. It comes with a simple 4R35 movement from Seiko, so it hacks, it hand winds, it's got a quick set date, that's really about it. 42 hours power reserve, which you will be able to use because it does hand wind. Legibility, it's pretty good actually. I've got one quibble with it, and we'll deal with that in a second. The big flat dial and the clean high contrast Arabics make everything really quite easy to see. That's sort of the nature of both the way the Arabics have been done and those big fat sword hands. The only quibble I've got is with the hour hand, which is I think a little bit short. Now I understand why they want to do that. They're sticking with the whole kind of aesthetic of having the hour hand fall inside that inner 24-hour track. I just don't think it's particularly helpful. That inner track is all very nice, and it sort of gives you that pilot watch feel, or that field watch feel, bit of either. But at the end of the day, it actually limits your kind of visibility. So I would have preferred the hour hand to be a bit longer. Power reserve, as I said earlier, it's the standard 42 hours. It's about industry standard for this $300-ish range. You can get up to 50 hours if you jump up to a watch with a 6R15 movement, but then you're looking at probably double and perhaps triple the price of this watch. In terms of versatility, like who can it fit and who can it wear, from a wearability point of view, it's on the bigger size, 42 millimeters across, 50 millimeters lug to lug, 13 millimeters thick, so it's not enormously thick. So it's kind of on the bigger end. That said, it easily fits my 7.5-inch wrist, and I can see this going down to probably about a 6.5-inch wrist fairly comfortably. The lugs are reasonably low set, and they shape the watch around the wrist a fair bit, so it does kind of shrink the watch on your wrist. So it's a relatively wearable watch. Particularly small wrists are probably out of luck. Anyone with an average or larger wrist, you're going to carry this one off fine. In terms of robustness, a bit of a mixed story here. 316L steel, pretty much the industry standard. Hardlex, which is their version of mineral crystal only. Some people don't mind it. I've personally had a number of chips and scratches on both mineral and Hardlex crystal watches. My personal preference is to go sapphire all the time. It does come with 100 meters water resistance, which is actually pretty cool, but it's not a screw down crown. So there's a little bit of trust that you have to take in the Seiko water sealing system there. I personally don't put that level of trust in it, so when I take this watch away, I always take a diver with me just in case I want to go near a pool or for a swim. In terms of band, like all kind of tooly working watches from Seiko, it comes with drilled lugs, so it's piece of piss to change the bands out, which is really great. It is a little bit of a strap monster. It likes accepting lots of different bands on the watch. That said, remember I said before that the lugs are they do wrap around the wrist a fair bit. They do still protrude, they do still sort of hang a little bit above what's a bit of a pot-bellied case back. So if you try and put this watch on a NATO, particularly given that it's quite a heavy watch, it'll get a bit wobbly. So from a band's point of view, it is quite versatile. You can use a lot of bands on it, but if you're going to use NATOs, I'd suggest you want to stick to really quite thin ones. Probably steer away from any of the big, like 1.5 mil leather bands. You'll probably find the watch wobbles around a fair bit. In terms of looks, it's like a field watch and a dive watch and an air and a pilot's watch all got together and had a baby. It's a big chunky hunk of steel like a diver would be. It's kind of like a field watch with that very stark Arabic markings on the dial, and the inner 24-hour ring, and then it's kind of like a pilot's watch with the big sword hands and just the sizing of it. So it's a bit of a mix. It's not really anything specific, so it's probably, maybe you could just call it the archetypal dressy tool watch thing. In terms of case shaping, it could barely be simpler. I find it quite difficult to come up with things to say about the case shaping. It is kind of generic. There's no flourishes on this at all. So there's no bevels or chamfering. There's no complex curves. It's, as I said, about as simple as it can get. Thankfully, the stepped bezel and the angled lower edge do break up the mid case a little bit. If they'd have not done that, the side of this case would have been just like this massive, great slab of dull. Thankfully, the beveling in the mid case does break that up a little bit. But let's face it, it's kind of boring. There's nothing offensive in the shaping or the shaping of this case, but there's certainly nothing exciting about it. In terms of finishing, again, nothing offensive, nothing big. So there's kind of a light polish on the side case, kind of a light brushing on the upper sides of the lugs, a light polish on the bezel. It's just like, it's a little bit of everything. They've clearly put some thought into it, but not a lot of thought. It's kind of like the spec sheet would have read well in terms of polished and brushed, but by the time it was all done, there wasn't much going on. However, the interesting thing is when they got to the dial, clearly they had a very different brief. It's perhaps the only interesting part of this watch. And on the other hand, the dial is almost always the most important part of a watch. So perhaps that's just where they chose to spend their money here. It's quite obviously, as I've said a couple of times, kind of field watch derived with those big bold Arabics and that inner 24-hour ring. It's multi-layered and quite interestingly textured. So again, really interesting that they put so little effort into the texturing and the finishing of the case, but put so much effort into the dial. I was really quite surprised by that. Very thick. It's a very thick bezel for a non-diver, but on the other hand, that's probably for the best. This is a big watch, and that dial would have been ridiculous with huge amounts of empty space if they hadn't have essentially shrunk the dial by putting that quite thick bezel around it. The printed numerals are just very simple sans serif Arabics. I don't think this was a case of laziness. I think this was a deliberate design choice and probably a smart one, given that they're going for that kind of field military watch look. Everything's a little bit squashed. It's not bad. I would have preferred it if they could have opened up those numerals a little bit, which kind of goes against what I said before about the idea that shrinking the dial a little bit with a thick bezel was a smart idea. So perhaps I still believe that they did the right thing by making the bezel quite thick and shrinking the dial. But I think they could have come up with an ever so slightly different font to kind of stretch those numbers out so they weren't quite so squashed. Normally I don't care about Lume. I don't do a lot of Lume shots. It doesn't worry me much. In this particular case, I was quite frustrated though by the lack of Lume. I'd just come off doing a review of my Fortis Flieger, which has all loomed numerals, and then I looked at this and it screams loomed Arabics. If you look at the way they've color matched the interior of the Arabics and the hands, you just expect that this is going to be an absolute loom monster, and then you are set up for disappointment. It's all fake. There's nothing going on there. So when you turn the lights off, you see the hands, but that's it. And I found that, like I said, I don't care about Lume, but being tricked into thinking I'm going to get this exciting Lume show and then not, I found myself very disappointed. I do like the polished edges that they've put around the Arabics. That's really nice. That adds to both the kind of feeling of class and the legibility. And I also do like the fact that there's very limited text. Seiko does this a lot. Or maybe you put it the other way, Seiko doesn't do this much. They don't put a lot on their dials, which I really like. I dislike it when I see 4, 5 or even 6 lines of text on a dial. The date application is quite quite possibly the single ugliest application of a date ever, with the possible exception of those that have got Cyclops windows. It's the dismembered 6 is just painful to look at every time I look at this watch. It's and a cheap looking white on black, the white not matching with anything else on the color and creating a discordant note. As I said, it is probably the ugliest, laziest and crappiest date application I've seen on any watch ever. It's really, I found it quite difficult to believe they even went ahead with this, that no one looked at this finished watch and said, no, that can't be allowed to go forward. So it's just weird. The Roman sword hands are a lot nice. It's a style of hand I really like, and I think it goes well with this watch. Nice, clean, crisp, legible. As I said earlier, I would have liked it if the hour hand was just a smidge longer. It would have added to both, I think, the looks and also the legibility. Okay, it has a crystal case back, nothing particularly special here. An incredibly workmanlike movement behind that case back, so you're not seeing much. On the other hand, this kind of watch is quite often someone's first mechanical watch, and I think it's always useful for a watch in this segment to sort of make that obvious by having that clear case backs. On the wrist, it looks okay. The wrist, the lug placement is okay, not too high, not super low, so it does sit a little bit proud, but certainly with a bracelet, it's not too bad. I think again, if you had like a NATO, particularly a thicker double pass NATO, then it would look a little bit strange on the wrist. It sits pretty flat, doesn't hug the wrist completely, but overall it looks like it belongs where it looks like it belongs there. So let's talk about feel now, and as always, I start off with the controls. Okay, it's a typical 4R35 feel. The crown's probably on the big end of middling, 7mm across, nice and easy to grip. Good solid pop as you move it out from the base position. It does feel a little wishy-washy between first and second position, so you've got to pay quite close attention to where you've got it. But once it's in position, it stays there and doesn't drift in and out. It has a bit, like a lot of 4R movements, a little bit gritty when you're winding it up. In the hand, this watch feels a lot like a diver. It's got a lot of heft to it. But importantly, no sharp bits, nothing that's going to dig in as you hold it in your hand. It feels nice and solid and chunky. There's no tinniness or flex in the band attachments. On the wrist, that heaviness comes through again. As I've said before, watches for me fall into some fairly broad categories. It's difficult to say that one watch is more or less comfortable than any other on some kind of fine graded scale. What I would say here is this watch falls pretty comfortably into the comfortable area. In terms of build, again, it's okay. Look, across the board, the designers set the builders a pretty low bar to get over, and the builders pretty much managed to clear that very low bar. So it's kind of average everywhere. Where there's supposed to be a polish, yeah, there's a polish, but it's nothing special. Where there's supposed to be some brushing, there's some brushing, but it's nothing special. It's as I said earlier, it's one of these things which if you just read the spec sheet would sound okay, but in the metal is utterly unspectacular. Totally not matched by the dial, which is not spectacular, but as you get closer and closer through a loop, you begin to realize this thing was not only designed quite carefully, it's actually really well executed. Everything's really clean. Everything's really crisp. Everything's exactly where it should be. Yeah, it's still just stamped. It's not hand polished or anything like that. You're paying a couple of $100 for this. You're not going to get it. But the processes that have been done really well. The assembly has been done really well. They clearly decided that the dial was where they were going to spend their money, and they did okay there. In terms of movement, when you flip the watch over, absolutely nothing going on. It looks like it's a completely undecorated 4R35 movement. So yeah, it's there. From an ease of ownership point of view, this thing is going to be utterly trouble-free. To start with, the MSRP on this watch when it came out was around about $250 US. It's been discontinued. You will find them around occasionally. I'd expect that you would these days pay somewhere between $150 and maybe $200 US. at that price, it's okay, but unspectacular value. In terms of maintenance, it's an untouched Seiko. It could not be easier, but then on the other hand, it's so cheap, would you even bother fixing it if you broke? Finding one, if you do really like this thing, it will be tricky. I don't think it was ever an insanely popular watch, and it has been discontinued. I haven't actually seen many come up on eBay or Amazon, but they are around, and you're more likely to find one sort of stuffed in the corner of a suburban jeweler with a for sale sign on it than anywhere else right now. In terms of extras, it comes with a bracelet, which is it's a little bit better than the really shitty bracelets that they tend to give you with the XKX or the 5s, but it's still not great. Solid links with well fitted, but still the hollow or folded end links. Every link is removable, which is fairly cool. Fairly typical Seiko pin and collar system, brushed all over. The clasp has a single micro adjustment, so you're going to want to perhaps remove those links. No secondary guard, and it's a stamped clasp, obviously. Bracelet comes with a bit of Seiko rattle. Again, not terrible, not the end of the world, but it's probably not the best fitted, the best manufactured bracelet you'll come. Well, in fact, it's absolutely not the best fitted bracelet or manufactured bracelet you'll come across. All in all, it's like everything about this watch. It's not terrible, it's not uncomfortable, it's not going to fall apart on you, but it's just not great. Packaging. This is, for me, my environmental progressive lefty side comes out. I love the Seiko packaging in that there's bugger all of it. It comes in the standard white and blue Seiko box with a small pillow. Okay, now in terms of authenticity, I've really got mixed feelings about this watch. In terms of being true to itself, this watch is absolutely fine. It is a weird mashup of genres, but it's a weird mashup of genres that I haven't seen before. And whilst I think the final answer is still kind of dull, you can't knock the fact that it is itself. It's not a watch that I can remember seeing anything that looks like. So that's probably, whilst dull, at least it's not a copy of any. In terms of its truth to its history and being in Seiko and its truth to the Seiko design language, this watch nails it. It could hardly be anything else but a Seiko, I think. This is a very authentic watch. But then when you get down to what I call the transparency, this is where I think the watch really lets it down. If you see this watch in a window and don't ask questions, you will think you're getting fully loomed Arabics. You will think you're going to get this absolute lume monster at night. And the watch is essentially lying to you. You are not going to get that. Okay, now this is my sort of the even weirder parts of my review where I start talking about watch power. And watch power is, think of it this way, it's the strength of that appreciative nod or ironic shake of the head you're going to get from another geek when they do or don't see this watch. And ultimately this watch has no real watch power at all. There's nothing particularly good about it and not particularly bad about it. It's not a pretend anything, so you're not going to get anyone kind of shaking their head at it. But on the other hand, it's not particularly positive. It's not a watch that is particularly popular. It's not particularly culty. It doesn't really stand out in any particular way. A stone dropped in a really deep lake. After a few seconds, all the ripples are gone and it's as if it was never there in the first place. So then if you start thinking about what's positional power of this watch when you're wearing it, at the end of the day, it's a low-end Seiko. It's at best workmanlike. It's definitely not fashion or a fashionable watch, so that's a good thing. It's a very blue-collar, hands-on, labourers kind of watch. I don't think I've, even including things like an SKX, I've never had another watch which screams beta quite so much as this. So if you have got this watch and you're wearing it, be prepared for a lot of questions like, what other watch do you own? Nice beta, what would you be normally wearing? That sort of thing. So what's the verdict? Are we going to swipe left, bad, or right, good on this watch? Personally, I can't recommend this to other people. I would generally say swipe left on this one. And it's curious because except for that excruciatingly bad 6, there's actually not much wrong with this watch, but there's just not a huge amount right. The dial is excellent, except for that truncated and beheaded 6, but you've got to get really close and you've really got to be looking at it to see that But if you sort of step back and look at the watch just on your wrist or in the watch box, it is so dull that it's hard for me to recommend. And since I can't recommend it, I tend to fall into a swipe left, not recommend. That does raise an interesting question. What the hell am I doing with it? Why did I buy it and why have I still got it? Very quickly, it was offered to me really cheap. I was that guy. I saw it in the corner of a jeweler's window. It was going for a ridiculously cheap price. It was at a time when I was impulsively buying watches, you know, in that kind of early phase that we all go through. And then subsequently getting it and learning to feel not much about it at all, I've discovered it's hardly worth it to sell. That said, it does have some interesting uses for me. If I travel somewhere where the security briefing is, as it was for a trip I did recently, you know, don't step outside the compound with anything you aren't prepared to have taken. It's a great sacrificial watch. I get to wear a watch, but I'm not going to cry if it gets stolen. And that probably says where this watch would fit and why you might want to buy it. So that's it. That's my review of the Seiko Neosport. Hardly a ringing endorsement. This is how I review watches. This is how I give my opinion about things. I hope this was to you. If it was, please subscribe and you'll see more videos like this. I do a watch review probably about once a month. The rest of the time I talk about issues, industry, collecting, all sorts of stuff. So look forward to seeing you. Leave comments below. Please like this video if you did, and I'll see you later. Bye.